On behalf of the chair of the program, Stephen Henry Madoff, and myself, Brian Kwan Wood, it's a real pleasure to welcome you all here today for our event entitled Curating Virtual and Domestic Spaces with José Esparza Chong Cuy and Asad Raza. It's really nice, it's really a pleasure to welcome you both here. And so what is really, I think, exciting about having these two with us today, which I will there is a plot twist I will even tell you later in a minute, is also just that I think it really activates a sort of like curatorial and spatial imaginary that is totally specific to our present time. But at the same time, also, well, I'll ask you. But also, it's important to remember that when Asad curated the home show in his own apartment, it was 2015, right? So the pandemic, as we know it, had not existed. So this show of his was, which he will discuss later, came from a totally different set of interests and necessities that have nothing to do, or maybe have something to do with the conditions that are forcing us to think in this sense. So it comes from much more of an imaginary, and maybe also informed somewhat by necessity as well, right? But the calculus is a bit different. Just to give you a sense, and maybe also we could even have a show of hands if you know how to do the little hand thing in you know, kind of like you know, like this in Zoom. Maybe can have a show of hands, because I did circulate a very short, what is it, like 13-minute walkthrough that Asad did of the home show exhibition and on Vimeo, and I hope many of you, or enough of you, have watched it before our meeting today. It's really great, and maybe I'll post the Vimeo link later in case you didn't see it. But for those who didn't, great, thanks guys. For those who didn't see it, I should emphasize that this exhibition is not like a small gesture or an afterthought, even though it took place in a very small space. It featured, I mean, maybe I'll just give you the artist list, no? It had works by Sabahat Ahsan, Sophia Amaria, Theo Boggs, Ian Chang, Jessica Dickinson, Mariah Evans, Yara Flores, Dan Graham, Diana Havas, Camille Unroe, Karsten Huller, Filippo Horan, Tom Jacobs, Q Jang Ah, Matthias Kessler, Jafar Kolb, Nick Mouse, Ari Markopoulos, Nico Maguro, Sarah Morris, Philippe Pareno, Asad himself, Samina Raza, Syed Tasnim Raza, Adrian Villarrojas, Rachel Rose, Regine Desfleurs, Sadiq Kane, Henri Sala, Tino Segal, Shazia Sikander, Joe Sander, Jordan Wolfson, right? So this is a serious exhibition in a very small space. So with that in mind, I think I will turn it over to our speakers, but there is a small plot twist that I want everyone to be aware of, which is really kind of a fun part of this panel. Jose actually lives in the apartment. Asad is joining us from Berlin, and Jose actually lives in the apartment where the home show was curated, in Asad's apartment on the Lower East Side of Manhattan. So so we have different levels of intimacy and yeah, so many plot twists. It's really a pleasure to welcome you both, Asad and Jose.
Thanks, Brian. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you so much for that introduction. It's fun. It is really a fun coincidence, although I think it's also a great place to start, no, Asad? About maybe almost like how we met, which, without getting kind of like too personal, but how I ended up living in this apartment where you did the exhibition, and how we're actually now have been talking about potentially doing kind of like a second home show together. What do you think?
Definitely. I mean, it's funny because, you know, people often think that we have to discuss the theoretical implications of what we've done and what the abstract meaning of what it is. But really, this whole talk has a very personal dimension for me because when I first met you, I hope you don't mind if I tell this story, Jose. But when I first met Jose, it was like 2007 or so. So about 15 years ago. And I used to go all the time because my apartment, which Jose is sitting in at the moment, which is now his apartment, or it's both of ours or something, uh, it's very small. And so when I would meet people to talk over things and to do meetings, I would basically always go to this cafe that was around the corner on the same block called Epistrophe. And at the time when I started going there in 2006 or so, in 2007, Jose was working there and was a barista. And I always remembered him right away because he was a very sharply dressed and very precise person, but also very funny. So he was just a person who you didn't forget. So over the next few years, I've probably ordered hundreds, probably maybe even thousands of espressos and cappuccinos from Jose. And specifically, especially in 2009, when I was producing this project at the Guggenheim Museum with Tino Segal, and we were hiring hundreds of people to take part in this project who would interact with and discuss the idea of progress with visitors. I interviewed, or the two of us interviewed, probably 95% of those people at Epistrophe, and Jose was always serving us those coffees.
And some of my colleagues ended up participating in the exhibition.
Exactly.
My fellow servers at the restaurant used to ended up working in that exhibition, right?
So a couple of them, I think. At the time, we were looking for people who had the ability to talk about ideas in an interesting way, no matter where they came from. And we had theater directors, we had journalists, we had professors, we had people who we met anywhere in New York. And but it's interesting because the other link is actually a link to the show, because it was precisely around that time when I'd been working in these quite big scales of, you know, a whole museum like the Guggenheim Rotunda or the Tate Modern, that this idea started brewing in my mind of doing a show that would be almost exactly the opposite. I remember, you know, there's this line from Christopher Marlowe in The Jew of Malta, where he talks about infinite riches in a little room. And that line kind of bounced around in my mind. I was thinking, you know, after doing these giant spaces, it could be interesting or fun or somehow produce something different, but also valuable to do something, take it very seriously, but to do something in the most humble space and the smallest space that I had, which in my case was my apartment. So
quite smart.
Anyhow, yeah, that's kind of, it's all wrapped up with you, Jose, and now you're living in there.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, and this we've talked about this several times, and I mean, as Asad mentioned, we met a while back. At the time, I was working as a server at Epistrophe, this cafe down the street, and I was also interning at Storefront for Art and Architecture, which is actually where I now work as director. A lot of things have happened since then, of course, but what really interests me is how, I mean, it's not that I'm living the life you were living when you were here, but there is like, that we both use that cafe. I still go to Epistrophe a lot, and it's somehow the extension of the living room of this place. Most of my meetings happen there. And it's just interesting for me to think about like how these domestic spaces can go beyond like the spaces that we live in, and how Epistrophe for me has become, and you certainly used it that way as well. It was somehow your office, your like home office. It has this kind of like little living room setup, where Asad sat down with Tino and interviewed these like 90-something people. But to conceptually think about how the domestic space can also be outside of our homes, and how is something that interests me a lot. And even though this place is quite small, I think we both kind of somehow, or think of it as a space where you could host that exhibition. And I mean, thinking about the way I use this little space as well, I mean, pre-pandemic, I was hosting a bunch of people, like artists from as you all probably can imagine, the situation, Storefront is quite a small organization, and many of the artists that we work with end up staying in this living room as well, which is somehow like Asad, when you were producing the show with Tino, I think Tino was also living here with you in this like really small apartments, but how somehow the home becomes an extension of like, not necessarily the workplace, but like how we understand the workplace in this very domestic setting, for me is something that is not new to the pandemic, and that it's just somehow the way I've been working with artists as well, is something that's, I think, connects our two practices in an interesting way.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the difference between what we did, what we tried to do, or what I tried to do in the apartment show, and exhibitions that take place in apartments, because there's a long tradition of exhibitions that take place in apartments, is that typically the apartment is kind of cleared and the space is sort of neutralized, and it becomes kind of like you have an apartment, which is now a gallery, and then you put work in there and show it to people. But in the case of the apartment that we share, Jose, it's that's not really that's not practical, because it's just too small. And so your life and your work and your own life bleeds in to the place, no matter what you do. And so in the case of the home show, which happened 5-6 years ago now, I remember thinking it's actually more interesting to ask artists to do something to my life than to put something in my space. So I think if you think about the difference between that, to act on a life rather than to fill somebody's space, that I think would be something I was interested in at the time. So for instance, you're seeing a picture right now of the toothpaste that Karsten Haller made, which I was supposed to use every day, and which was supposed to give you very, very vivid dreams. It was called his dream toothpaste. And so obviously he was acting on me rather than just displaying something in the space in the standard sense of a sculpture. Or if you scroll down to the picture which we saw before of Camille Rowe's Ikebana, which is here. So this Ikebana, this flower arrangement, not only was it a vase that she designed and painted, but the actual arrangement was taught by her to me. So I had to do that every couple of days, again, with fresh flowers bought from a specific place that Camille wanted me to go. She didn't want me to buy flowers from a bodega or from a flower shop. She wanted me to go to the flower district, to the wholesalers, and get the best quality flowers. And then I had to trim them in a certain way and arrange them in a certain way. And so again, it was like a practice or a ritual that I was doing. And it's nice now because you see Jose, it's nice.
My bodega flowers, though.
Exactly. Well, they're not Camille Rowe approved flowers, but it's okay. But the view is the same. And so those things were very interesting to go through. You know, I think another project that happened was Sofia Almeria's piece, where she asked me to basically practice a kind of religious ritual that she created, which she called Hex, where I would write down things that I wanted to happen on a piece of paper, and then soak the paper in soy milk, and then crumple it up and stuff it into the shower drain, and then put this clump of her hair that she had sent me on top of that. So it looked like the shower drain was sort of clogged with her hair, which was a very macabre, weird thing to do. But it was also a ritual every day that I would do before the show opened to visitors. And it was something like a religious practice. So again, she acted on the occupant of the apartment rather than just the space. And I think in that apartment, and in a lot of New York apartments, you do have to let your life and what else is happening, you can't separate them so much. And so you can, in a way, you can say that's a problem, or you can somehow learn from it. I guess, I don't know if that's what you were getting at, Jose, but I think that,
yeah.
Something I learned, because now right now I'm staying in this very large apartment in Berlin, where apartments are much larger, and I feel kind of strange about it. I'm not sure what to do, because I have rooms that I can just go to, you know, and do something, and it's not necessarily necessary.
Asad, and one of the things also that is interesting of this exhibition was that how it really changed a lot of kind of like your daily routines and like what you could do in your apartment. No, and I mean, I think that this work by Adrián Villarrojas has been an interesting one, because it kind of continued to exist after you even left this apartment, which I then lived with for a bit. And the situation with this specific work actually has been a subject of a conversation that Asad and I have been having for quite some time, because actually, so this was like almost like a permanent piece installed in the freezer. But then I was on a long trip to Mexico, and when I returned, the fridge was broke. And basically, of course, like everything that was in the freezer had rotted. And I had to clean it up and eventually had to change the freezer. But it brought up some interesting kind of like conversations and discussions about like if the fridge was a part of the work, and if it should be recreated or not. I think it also became kind of like quite an important piece for Adrian himself, where he ended up continuing to do several of these sort of like frozen still lifes, no?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a very interesting piece also, and it's a very brilliant piece that he did. And I'm very happy that he did it and that it continued. It was a helpful move for him in his own practice, because at the time he was actually staying with me because we're friends, and he had this idea to do something in the freezer, and I could never have imagined how beautiful what he was going to do would be. And also, of course, it has this built-in fragility, which is produced by the fact that every time you open the freezer, you're allowing warm air into it, and you're allowing it to decompose a little bit more. So you can only ever really open it. I only ever really wanted to open it once he had made this kind of nature more or still life with these frozen seafoods and vegetables in there. I never wanted to open it for more than 15 or 20 seconds at a time. So you would never really even be able to look at it for that long. And these constraints that were produced by the way that he made the piece ended up being part of the experience of it too. And I think that's a good example of how an artwork can sort of go beyond just an idea or a description and create something that you have to experience. You have to go and experience it. To look at the picture doesn't really do much, although it's nice that people have it. And he did a lot of very fine details. For instance, he had these beer bottles and the beer had leaked out of them because he had slightly opened the caps and created this kind of frozen waterfalls. And he had this lobster that was lying in this very kind of pathos inducing way. I mean, he did really an amazing thing there. So, of course, later, this whole issue with the fridge came about. And even before, Jose, you moved in, there was an issue because Elena Filipovic from the Kunsthalle Basel wanted to show this piece. And there was actually a conversation where she called and say, what can we do in order to bring that piece to Basel? And I was sort of thinking, well, that's my fridge. So, I mean, I guess I could just get a new fridge, but I also felt like, well, it would be tough to keep the whole thing cold enough for it not to thaw and rot between here and Basel, Switzerland. So in the end, Adrian did a new one there, but these questions that piece brought up, which I think in a way got produced also by the act of asking him to do something in such a small place, in such a humble place, that he picked the freezer of a small New York apartment. That's an example of maybe how constraints can enable you also. I'm sad that you had to come back to the rotten version though. And
there is a new fridge.
Yeah, the new fridge looks nice.
But it's interesting that you talk about these constraints, because in the situation that we currently are, you've started a new project that's called Home Cooking. Maybe you would want to share a little bit about that, Asad.
I mean, sure. It really was just born out of the pandemic, because I felt that all the institutions were basically just pointing you to walkthroughs of their shows, which were closed to the public, or asking you to look at their archives and their websites. And it seemed like a moment to do something where you could actually experience new things, not just canned or expired stuff, to use the metaphor that we've been going with, speaking about Adrian's piece. So a group of artists and I together started basically creating a kind of artist-run space online, which ended up with a lot of different channels, a Google document and a Twitch channel and a Vimeo and a SoundCloud and a YouTube. So the idea was to put it all over the place so that it wouldn't be dominated by one tech platform or one tech company. And about 70 artists contributed over the first 6-7 months, and they all did original projects. Some of them did visual images that would be posted. Some of them did video, some did live things. Lydia Uramane from Algeria basically just walked around in the hills of the rural part of Algeria where she was living, and that was actually very soothing at the time because of the pandemic situation of claustrophobia. And so all of these artists sort of brought different experiences to light. And I think the constraint was interesting because most of them and myself had never really done anything on the internet or digital in nature. And so asking them to do it at a moment when that was the only option really to do something, if you wanted to do something, brought other kinds of projects out. And for my contribution, I actually decided to interview a bunch of curators about what they do so that we would kind of reverse a little bit the normal polarity of artists being quizzed and dissected by a curator at an institution. And that whole series, which we did, was ended up being, I think, very interesting for me to do. So that was sort of what we got up to with home cooking. The name relates to the home show, but it didn't come from me, actually. It came from Mariana Simnett, who said this whole thing is like, what we're trying to do is like, because we don't have the chance to go to the restaurant right now, it's basically kind of like home cooking, what we're doing.
And there was a lot of cooking also, no? In the show, or not really?
A number of people did do, I mean, some of the best things, if people look up the home cooking archive, for instance, Korakrit, Arun Anandchai's recipe for what he calls memory sauce, which is an extremely spicy Thai kind of dipping sauce. It's incredible. I mean, I highly recommend that you go and make that and use it. And Dora Budor's soups,
I saw that one.
Stuff were very good too. So yeah, a number.
And it went on for like hours, that one, no? Or that was a long one, no?
Yeah, I mean, it's at in the early days of the pandemic, people had not really generated their life again. There was a sudden evacuation of the life routines of most people and the work routines of most people, so that people were just really happy to do stuff. And I think now people have generated a sense of what their daily routine is again, and they've kind of become normalized to this situation a little bit more. So I wouldn't, and that's why home cooking has slowed down considerably, because I don't personally feel like asking artists who are back in their normal routines, making their own work, to do something in this way, without support, without a lot of support. It doesn't feel like the same thing as it did from March to say July of last year.
I think we can start planning the second version of the home show here. But it was interesting. It was interesting also to hear you talk about this, or briefly mention the history of kind of like exhibitions in apartments, because it is true. It's not that it's like the only apartment exhibition that has happened. I mean, there's this like long tradition, and in fact, many kind of like informal projects that begin in domestic spaces end up becoming either like from commercial galleries or big kind of like projects. Another thing that I think that is not always discussed is like these kind of like iconic houses where there's been kind of like exhibitions or there's exhibition programs. If you think of like the Casa Barragan or the Lina Bobardi house, or in Sao Paulo, there's many of these kind of like exhibitions of houses that are preserved because of their, I guess, either the work of like the biography of the person who lived there, or their architectural relevance or whatnot. But it's something that I've questioned a lot is that, for example, like the Lina Bobardi house in Sao Paulo for me is a really interesting example, because they've recently been doing kind of exhibitions in partnership with MASPI, which is the Museum of Art of Sao Paulo that was built by Lina Bobardi. And sometimes they've been doing these partnerships, and it serves as an archive. I find it that in a lot of the cases, these houses somehow don't, that they see the potential in kind of like doing other things rather than just serve like the biography of the like in that case Lina Bobardi. So for example, previous to those partnerships, the Lina Bobardi house was mainly the archive, and as in the case of like Casa Luis Barragan, it was really only like you would visit it and it was left almost intact as to how he lived in it. And the tours that they tell you just like reaffirm that sort of like his lifestyle, and like this is where he slept and this is, but to think of the potential of those spaces to engage in a kind of like a contemporary discourse with other artworks is something that I find quite interesting. Although I'm sure that people who go and visit those spaces for architectural reasons might be a little bit bummed out if there's like a contemporary art exhibition. But I wonder if you've given some thought to that as well.
Well, I think it's exactly right. The issue that, I mean, I agree with you that the issue is basically that on the one hand, you don't want to create a kind of mausoleum, you know, even though the Casa Barragan is an incredible, I mean, I would urge everyone to go to visit the Casa Barragan at least once, just the way it is. And I've actually seen some quite interesting exhibitions there by artists like Pedro Reyes and Kareth Wynne Evans. And same with the Lino Bobardi House, or for instance, the John Soane Museum in London. I think everyone should try to get to see that at some point. On the other hand, I think exhibitions and art is, in my opinion, it should move, it gains relevance and it gains resonance by moving in the direction of an experience that's happening in the present moment, rather than just the observation of the evidence of something from the past. And so the trick is to sort of stage that within a person who's long deceased, the kind of decor in which they lived. And so in order to do that, I think you essentially have to create a dialogue between the ghost and the guest, as you know, this famous formulation of Duchamp: guest plus a ghost equals a host. So you somehow have to make that equation when you work in those kind of spaces. And it's interesting because in the contemporary art world, we're usually asked to fill former industrial spaces that have now been transformed into art places, like Tate Modern and many, many others. Or you have these house issues. And in both cases, I find that it's a lot about creating a dialogue with the history of the place, or with the kind of ghosts that are in that place. And you know, if you would work in your own apartment, that conversation changes a lot, which of course is our plan, is to do the home show part 2 together with you as the main proprietor. But I'm hoping that you'll do what I did and give tours, because in my version of the home show, I only allowed people to see it through a tour with me, so that I wanted to make it really about, you know, the experience of knowing who this person who actually lives here is.
About being that host. About being that host.
Exactly, you're the host, but it's tiring, I'll tell you.
No, I've met a lot of people that end up telling me that they've been to this apartment because they saw the home show in 2015, which is quite funny.
It is funny.
But no, I find it quite interesting what you're saying about how there has to be this kind of contemporary dialogue. And I'm thinking about, say, the Trotsky House in Mexico City, for example, which is really, I mean, it's a fascinating place. And of course, Trotsky lived there, and it's like where there was like this attempted murder at him and whatnot, no? But no, actually, I think they even have like the object that he was stabbed with is like on display in the museum, in the house there, which is now a museum. But it's really kind of, it's really unattended, and there's no contemporary dialogue with anything that's happening now, and it's not really an active space. And I'm not saying that it has to, like, that doing a contemporary art exhibition is the only way to activate a space like the Trotsky House, but I mean, it has such an incredible history, but it's just like somehow sitting there, no? And whereas like in the Casa Barragan, where I mean, it's a very different character, but and people visit the house for different reasons, but there is there has been a series of exhibition programs that have happened there that have brought in a kind of like a very different type of visitor as well.
I think that's a very good point. And you know, one thing that I think is a problem in contemporary curating sometimes is that people people get very focused on coherence, on treating an exhibition as if it's a kind of like a seminar paper or an argument that has to have a kind of coherence and has to be very clearly understood. And exhibitions and the world of contemporary art, and I don't think it always needs that. And so, for instance, people sometimes get overly worried that if you would layer other things on top of a historic house like Trotsky's house or something, that people might get confused. But I actually think that people are very porous and very receptive to experiences that they don't fully understand. And gradually they will think about layers. So if you would do something like, for instance, the first time I went to the Casa Barragan, which is of course Luis Barragan's sort of frozen in his inimitable, colorful decor. There was this exhibition of Pedro Reyes there, and I didn't really understand exactly what was what, but then later I saw a second exhibition there, and I was like, okay, I get very clearly now what the artist brought and what they didn't bring and what was about. So I think you can profit from a certain amount of being not too worried about confusion or being too concerned with the coherence of something as if it's an argument, as if it's an intellectual argument. And in curating, there's a lot of times I think when even the curator themselves, if they don't understand why they're doing something, that's often a good sign, because they're grasping at something which they don't fully know. So it's not just about information transfer, it's about asking a question that you don't know the answer to either.
Yeah, definitely. No, it's there's this I did this little project in Mexico City couple of years ago, actually, in a house by an architect there that's not that well known, even like internationally or actually in Mexico, but he did some really, really important sort of architectural works. His name is Ernesto Gomez Gallardo, and it was very interesting because I was invited to do an exhibition in his house, which was built in the 1970s, which is in the south of the city. This like really big, beautiful, kind of like brutalist looking house that where he lived, where the architect lived with his family, and eventually he died and the family wanted to sell the house. And I was invited to do a show there by his grandson. Just like a really informal kind of exhibition. But what was interesting is that the grandson was somehow, who's an architect, was really attached to the house and really thought like kind of like saw the architectural relevance of the house, and certainly is a quite unique piece of architecture, and so the exhibition was somehow aiming to preserve the house, because some of the family members were trying to sell it to the best bidder, who would very likely not maintain the house as it was, and somehow the exhibition, which we titled Second Life, it was really focused in architectural preservation, basically. And we even invited kind of the person who is in charge of architectural preservation in Mexico City. We did a panel at the opening, and it was quite an interesting way of approaching an exhibition, where we included several works, some that were just like set in like the domestic space of where the architect lived, but many of the works that were in the exhibition were about preservation, including actually one by Pedro Reyes, which is this campaign that he's been doing about like a land art piece in Mexico City at UNAM, and he's trying to kind of like preserve it. But anyway,
you mean the big circular one?
Yeah, that big.
Wow, that's an incredible piece. That has nothing to do with domestic architecture, but an incredible piece.
but what the exhibition aimed to do was somehow to figure out, like through this exhibition, try to somehow create consciousness and preserve like the integrity, like the architectural integrity of the house, so that the family could somehow see that. What was interesting is that in the end, someone that had an architectural interest to the house ended up purchasing it, and sort of informally committed to preserve it as it was.
Right.
Which is kind of like an interesting example of also like what these domestic exhibitions can do.
True. And to bring something up that's very topical or very much just from the news of today, it strikes me that today was I think wasn't it today or was it yesterday, the announcement of Lacaton and Vassal, the French architects, winning the Pritzker Prize. Since you're a trained architecture historian, I figure maybe we talk a second about them, because I'm very happy that they won that award because of their approach of not destroying, but readapting things. Because it's basically my feeling that the idea of the 20th century, which is essentially about producing a blank space and then creating a wholly new experience or artwork or product or object on this blank canvas, on this cleared blank canvas. This is basically kind of a disaster, because after 150 years or so of that approach, which you could think of roughly as a kind of modernist approach, you have obviously a world that's in that's an environmental crisis. And so this idea of architecture that doesn't actually need to build from scratch, that occupies existing space and sort of twists it, or as the situationists would say, detourns it, instead of just replacing it. That's very appealing to me. And I think with the apartment shows, that logic is very much there, because you cannot just erase the past. Yeah, you can't get rid of it. You have to transform is one way to put it, but it's more subtle in a way. You because you cannot fully transform, so you have to somehow transmute a place into something else. And one of the ways that you can do that, of course, is with your own presence in a space, which can be a difference which doesn't even affect the physical space at all. So all of that, I think, comes into play when you start thinking about doing shows in domestic houses. And I also wanted to say that in the home show, it was very interesting that as I added works to it, purely by just instinctively asking friends and artists to do it, but also thinking about things, there seemed to be a play of scales, which we discussed with Brian earlier, that kind of happened where, even though we were in this very small apartment and the works, didn't have much space, a lot of the works seemed to refer to astronomy or the universe, or these very large scales of spans of time and spans of space. And there's something in that dialectic between a very limited actual physical space and then this big metaphorical space or imaginative space that I found interesting. And so I guess I'm only bringing that up because that was a very interesting and not predicted aspect of it for me. And it made me feel that, everyone should curate an exhibition at their house if they feel at all like doing that, because it's really interesting. You can definitely learn something from it, and it's actually also fun.
Yeah, although it's interesting. I mean, somehow we all do that already, even though you don't have visitors, or even though if you don't call it an exhibition, like the way you arrange your house and think about putting one thing next to the other, where you put your books, where you put, somehow it is already that sort of micro universe of yourself in a way.
So true. And Rachel Rose did a piece in my apartment show which really played on that, where she edited every one of my possessions. She looked at everything I owned and decided what I should take out and what I should keep. Oh boy, it's okay. Sorry, Jose. My daughter just arrived from school from her daycare. So, anyway, Brian is saying on the chat that we should move to taking questions. There's no cat. Jose doesn't have a cat.
I have a similar situation here with daughter around the same age. But maybe I'll start. I just typed oh good. We have one question.
There's a question, yeah.
But in quickly with a quick question of my own, which is just, I wonder whether the two of you had an agreement on the use of the apartment and the kind of custodianship of the exhibition. How does it continue, and how did you agree to continue it or not continue it, or let it happen?
There's no real major agreement. Jose is just the resident of the apartment and continues as he pleases. But there's no. I guess the only agreement is our friendship-based agreement. that he's staying in the
I
apartment.
mean, the one I remember when we were talking seriously about me moving here, you were already living in Berlin. I think I ran into you at like an event at the American Society while you were already, you did that exhibition at the American Society, actually. That was, and I was visiting to see apartments because at the time I was living in Chicago before I moved back. And I had I was like, what? By the way, what, like, do you still have the Spring Street apartments? And I think your cousin was living here, no, at the time.
That's right.
And yeah, the only thing you told me was like, the only thing is you won't have a freezer and you have to take care of the Adrián Villarrojas piece, which unfortunately ended up sort of.
And what did you do? You destroyed it.
I broke the contract. I broke the agreement.
And yet, and there you are still.
We do have a question here from Yam Chu O.
Okay.
A question for Asad. Thank you for sharing your work experience. I like what you said about not necessarily having coherence, in quotes, in putting together a show. Yes to believing in our audience's porosity and openness. What did you learn from putting on the home show that you wished you knew or would have done differently?
That's a good question. You know, I think I would have let it, I think I would have let it run for a little bit longer because it was slowly, more and more people got to see it, but in the end, not that many people did. The first day there was only 2 people. The second day there was 0. The third day there was like 1. And then it started to grow. But in the end, I felt like actually it was a pretty interesting exhibition and it would have been nice to have more people get the chance to see it. So maybe I would have run it for a couple months. And the second thing is I would have tried to keep it a little cleaner maybe. It was sometimes not the cleanest. It wasn't quite as clean as it could be since I was also the custodial staff of the exhibition. And the third thing is that I had this thing which I sometimes did where there was food at the apartment. I would offer it to people who came. I remember Chris Liu came one day and I offered him to eat something afterwards. And that really led to a whole long, interesting conversation. And so I feel I could have done that more. Offer the people who came something to eat. It seems simple, but you don't really want to do it normally. But when you do, it really leads to a whole interesting encounter and conversation. Oh boy, Alma. 1 second, I'm gonna see if I can get her to go to the other room for a minute so we can keep going.
It's okay. It happens to me. It happens to me all the time. Jose, maybe also you could tell us a bit about the about your ideas for another edition. Would it take place in?
I mean, it was funny. It was actually during the pandemic that I emailed Asad and I was like, maybe we should do another one of these of your home shows. And the conversation hasn't really started. Actually, your prompt to have this conversation is somewhat a good excuse for us to talk about it a little bit more. But I love what you said about like the cooking, actually, because basically like what you're saying is, Asad, is like you could have been a better host in your exhibition, and that would have made it kind of like to have more of these like conversations with people in a more in a different, like in a more domestic setting, basically, but about the works that you included. What I really find quite great about that show is how serious you took it, you know, and how kind of like serious that artist list is. You know, like it's a really big kind of artist list. It's a lot of artists also for such a tiny space. And I really love kind of like how serious. You probably even did a press release also, no?
Actually, you know, at the time I asked a pretty well-known curator to write the press release as its own bit of the show, and they just didn't deliver. So then in the end, I didn't do any press release or anything like that. But I think the point was, in a way, this reversal or this twist that, look, I'm going to do a show at my own house, but rather than make it very humble and try to kind of scale it down to my house, I was thinking, no, this should be a show that if you saw this artist list at MoMA, you would be like, yeah, this is a great looking show. And you would not think it didn't belong there. You would actually think this is a very interesting sounding show there, but it was at the apartment. So, you know, I was conscious that I wanted to create a very, with the artists who I thought were the best artists in the world. So, and the ones who I had access to, being able to ask. No, nobody said no, by the way, except one artist who I won't name, who's a very good artist who lives in New York. And Adriana and I both asked him, or we talked about him, and then I emailed him. But that artist did not say yes, but it was also the only artist that neither of us had ever met, or that I had never met. And in the case of Adriana, and so I think that meant a lot, you know, and that's why I think it's okay that we started this conversation by talking about, you know, the general audience may not want to know or doesn't really care if we had, you know, used to hang out at a coffee shop, but those connections are actually super crucial, and they're usually occluded in people's kind of official description of what happened. But in the case of that exhibition, maybe it mattered because the only artist we asked who we hadn't actually met didn't take part.
Maybe it also has to do with the intimacy of the request. Maybe it's a bit forward to invite them all, to invite them so far into your own home. But actually, this is a bit related to the next question from Andrea. I'm sorry. From Anna Magyari. Do you think the intimate place of the apartment also created a community during the show? Between artists, between visitors. Could you talk a bit more about these encounters? But maybe also you've just spoken a bit about it.
Well, yes. I mean, at the risk of talking so much about this show from 6 years ago, for sure, there were many moments when, for instance, particularly when we started adding pieces, at a certain moment in the show, we would add a new piece each week. I thought that was an interesting thing to do. And at one week, it was a piece by Mariah Evans, the choreographer, and she would actually come with 2 of her or 3 of her dancers, and they would do it sitting on the floor while the visitors sat on the couch after the rest of the tour. So that really made it feel like a monkey, what do you call that? A clown car, you know, because there was so many people packed in doing things in this place. But then there were moments when other artists would come and visit, like Jessica Dickinson or Jordan Wolfson, and then they would watch Mariah's performance, and then everyone would go out for a drink. And there was for sure moments of high community, you know, people who I think got to interact with each other, got to know each other for the first time through that. So, I mean, I don't have much interesting to say about it other than it did happen. And I think Jose is doing something similar even without an exhibition, because I'm hearing all the time about people who were like, oh, guess what? I was at your old apartment the other day because Jose invited me for dinner or whatever. Not during the pandemic, of course.
Even I met Mariah at a park not too long ago and she's like, oh, I used to live in your apartment, because I think she lived here as well after, no?
When I was in Brussels, actually, when I had become the artistic director of another house, the Villa en Pan, a very large house, but that's now an art space, Mariah took over for me. So yeah, there seems to be some sort of fellowship in relation to that space.
It somehow still creates these links.
It does.
Another 2 short questions. Maybe they're short, so I'll ask them at the same time. The first from Andrea, did you have an online presence at the time? Is there a website or other tangible form of transferring information existing that represents the show? And then the second question, slightly different, from Kimberly Rush Doigerlua. I'm trying to think through the juxtaposition of the exhibition with the domestic space and the power dynamics of the gallery. Do you have observations to share on that?
Well, about the physical, there's no website, but there's a book. The book, unfortunately, all the copies have been sold, but I think you can find them online, and it's called Home Show, the book. I actually think people contributed some, in my opinion, interesting pieces of writing to it. So you could pick that up. And then for the other question about the power dynamics of the gallery, I mean, to me, the gallery is, in New York, it sort of dominates people's imagination, and in the USA, particularly the market price of artworks and their relationship to the gallery and to selling is very strong in the mind. I think it's created by a very strong link also in the media between art and this kind of capitalist speculation. But that, in my opinion, is not necessarily the end all and be all of art, or the intimate connection that you can have with an artwork. So in that sense, I think, you know, I've also curated shows in galleries, for instance, Metro Pictures a couple of years ago. And I know that, you know, Jose has obviously also curated shows all over the world in museums and galleries. But it's just another option, another choice to do something in a home. I don't know. Jose, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, and of course, there is like these power dynamics are quite present. But I think what we were mentioning about just like having to incorporate the narrative of like this, like the domestic space where you are working with is important. Like at least it's important for me when I've like in these couple of exhibitions that I've done in non-conventional spaces. Whereas, yeah, like the white cube is that white cube that's like kind of detached from these meanings, but of course it has a very different type of connection to the things you were just mentioning, from like the market to kind of like the galleries, like the larger gallery system and whatnot. So I think that like the possibility of incorporating the narrative of like the domestic space and who lived there, or like, I mean, there's many kind of like things you can kind of source conceptual narratives and threads in a domestic setting.
No, I agree. I agree with that.
So there's there's two more questions. Okay, maybe I'll and since we're also running short on time, I think maybe maybe we can just take, after these two questions, maybe just like one last one from the audience, so we don't keep everyone for too long. The first question from Clifford Lowe: can you speak further about how you saw your obligations to each during the project in your capacities, both as guest and host? Did that evolve throughout the project at all? Maybe I'll wait on the next question.
Is that a question for me about the exhibition at the apartment?
I think so. No?
Yeah, I think so.
I'm not sure what guest and host means, but I would just answer it very shortly by saying yes, it evolved in the sense that actually I felt I could be a better host at the beginning when there were less people, because you could hang out with someone for 2 hours. But then later, I had marked 6 hours a day to do this, you know, from 12 to 6. That was like the opening hours. But towards the end, there was like 10 people every time I went downstairs. And so you couldn't really spend as much time with people, and it didn't become as it didn't become as intense, I guess, or you didn't get as rich of an experience. So
you did have hours, Asad.
I had hours, yeah, but you could also come outside the hours, because people would just call me and say like, I can only come at X time, and I would say like, okay, well, whatever, come then. But basically I was giving these kind of tours to people from 12 to 6 every day.
And there was visitors that you didn't know, right?
A lot, yeah. Well, as it went on, because it sort of like, that was a time, you know, people weren't maybe as well, they were pretty active on social media already in 2015, but people started posting about it. Nancy Spector did some posts about it early on, and I think that made a lot of people want to see it.
So for the second question, and maybe the last of the day, is I think a really good question, and could or should be directed at both of you. I've been doing some research from Louise Burns. I've been doing some research into the idea of living with art in your own domestic space, as opposed to only observing it for a short period in a gallery. How did you find living with the exhibition in your home? And did this alter your understanding or relationship with the art? And I think the question is also really interesting in relation to what you were saying earlier about ghosts in spaces.
Well, Jose, what do you think about this one? I got to think for a minute.
About living with art and like the relationship with the artwork. Yeah, I mean, I was just thinking about that program at MoMA. I think it was like in the 50s, no, where there was I think like patrons could loan works from the collection to live with them for a bit in their houses. I don't know exactly, I can't remember the name of the program, but I found it, I remember it being quite fascinated by that idea. Someone is saying that MIT had a program also, where gallery show allows from the works from the collection. But I don't know. It's interesting. In this tiny little house where I live, I keep changing things all the time, and they're not necessarily artworks, but I keep moving things around, and I like hang something on the wall, and then I remove it for like 2 months. Because I'm like, I think maybe the wall should not have anything, and it's. I'm not used to living with artwork, I have to say, but it's I think that what happened in the case of your exhibition was quite different, because many of those artworks, Asad, kind of required you to engage with them in a quite demanding way, from the flowers to the freezer to the ritual to the toothpaste. I mean, they were sort of performative artworks as well.
Yeah, and they make an impact on you in a deep way, for sure. And also Rachel's piece where she edited all my possessions. I mean,
Yeah.
she's literally the first person who has ever looked through every single thing I own, and that was itself a big experience. And it you know, it made an impact. So I think living with the stuff, as you can imagine, I have nothing profound to say about other than, yeah, you develop a richer, even richer relationship to it, because you can contemplate a work in all different times of you know, of day, night, and during different parts of the season, and you have a longer time to develop a relationship with it, as it has a longer time to act on you. So again, I recommend trying to curate a show at your own apartment.
Yeah.
And maybe just to close, there's a final, not question, but a statement from Susan Sensler.
Hi, Susan.
Who says, thanks so much, inspiring dialogue. Thoughts drifts to the book Curated Decay, which opens to the idea of not preservation, returning, but yielding an art of transience, open to the continuous ecology of the space to evolve, grow, and change. So Asad, Jose, thank you so much for this fantastic discussion and for being with us today.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you for the invitation. Thanks.
Take
Bye.
it easy.
Thanks.